In the winter of 1692, a group of settlers had established a small community in a remote corner of colonial New England. The harsh winter hit the region hard, and the settlers found themselves isolated and cut off from the outside world. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, tensions among the settlers began to rise. It started with small things, accusations of theft, rumors of hoarded food, but soon grew into something much more sinister. People began to turn on each other, whispering about their neighbors in the dark of night. Friendships dissolved, families turned against each other, and the once close community became a place of fear and suspicion. The winter was brutal, with snow drifts piling up around the tiny settlement, and food becoming increasingly scarce. As the settlers struggled to survive, their paranoia and fear continued to grow. Some began to see shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, or heard strange whispers in the night. At first, they dismissed these as tricks of the mind brought on by hunger and fear, but as the days wore on, the settlers became convinced that there was something else in their midst. Some whispered of witches, others spoke of demons or other malevolent spirits. As the winter dragged on, the settlers began to take matters into their own hands. Accusations turned into trials, and trials turned into executions. Innocent people were accused and convicted of witchcraft, and were hanged or burned at the stake. Others were beaten or killed outright in acts of violent madness. By the time spring arrived, a group of natives had come to check on the community, only to find all of the settlers dead. Some had died of starvation, but most had been killed in acts of violence. The village was silent and empty, the only sounds coming from the creaking of ropes and the rustling of leaves in the wind. As the news of the small community's disappearance spread, a group of Native Americans who lived nearby decided to investigate. They had heard rumors of the settlers' growing paranoia and violence, and were concerned for their safety. When they arrived at the settlement, they found a scene of devastation. The small houses were empty and abandoned, and the bodies of the settlers lay scattered throughout the village. Some had been hanged or burned at the stake, while others had been brutally murdered in their homes. The Native Americans were horrified by what they saw, and they knew that the settlers had succumbed to madness and paranoia. But they also sensed something else in the air, a dark and malevolent presence that seemed to linger over the abandoned village. As they searched the settlement, the Native Americans began to hear whispers and moans coming from the empty houses. They saw shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, and felt a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the winter weather. They knew that they had stumbled upon something terrible, something that they could not explain or understand. But they also knew that they needed to leave the settlement behind, and to never speak of it again. And so, they left the abandoned village behind, and went back to their own homes. It's unclear what drove the settlers to madness and violence. Perhaps it was the harsh winter, or the isolation and fear that came with it. Perhaps it was simply man's inhumanity towards fellow man. But some whispered that there was something else at work, something dark and malevolent that had preyed upon the settlers' fears and weaknesses, driving them to madness and violence. Whatever the cause, the tiny community in colonial New England had become a place of horror and tragedy, a warning to future settlers of the dangers that lay in the wilderness. The following winter, the Native American community that had discovered the abandoned settlement began to experience similar conflicts to those that had torn the settlers apart. It started with small disputes over food and resources, but soon escalated into violent clashes between different factions within the community. At first, the Native Americans tried to ignore the growing tension, hoping that it would resolve itself over time. But as the violence continued to escalate, they began to fear that something dark and malevolent had followed them back from the abandoned settlement. Many whispered that the settlers had unleashed an ancient curse, or that they had disturbed the spirits of the land in some way. Some even believed that the settlers had brought back an evil spirit with them, which had taken hold of the Native American community and was driving them to madness. As the winter wore on, the conflicts within the community grew more and more violent. Families turned against each other, and friends became bitter enemies. The young and the old alike were caught up in the madness, and it seemed as though the community was on the brink of tearing itself apart. But amidst the chaos, there was one young girl who refused to give up hope. Her name was Wachui, and she was known for her bravery and her sharp wit. Along with her older brother, Kem, she began to investigate the cause of the violence, searching for any clues that could help them stop the looming evil. As they dug deeper, they began to uncover a series of strange and unsettling events that had taken place in the weeks leading up to the violence. They found evidence of strange rituals, and heard whispers of dark forces at work within the community. With the help of a wise old shaman, Wachui and Kem were able to piece together the clues and identify the source of the evil that was driving the community to madness. They discovered that a powerful demon had taken hold of one of the community's leaders, and was using him as a vessel to spread chaos and violence. With the shaman's guidance, Wachui and Kem were able to confront the demon and banish it from the community. The violence and madness subsided, and the community was able to come together once again. But the memory of that dark winter lingered on, a warning to future generations of the dangers of evil and madness. And Wachui and Kem knew that they could never truly be at peace, knowing that the darkness could always return, and that they must always be ready to fight it. I hope you enjoyed my story. We release a new story every day. Like and subscribe for more content.